Hello everyone, and welcome to the Adams and Reese AR/HR Summit. I'm Margaret Myers. I'm a member of the Labor and Employment team at the firm, and I'm based in our Nashville office and have been practicing exclusively in the employment law arena for over 21 years. Joining me today is my colleague Rocky King, who is a litigator who's also based out of our Nashville office.
Who's not been practicing for 21 years, but go ahead, Margaret.
And we won't get into any age discrimination claims at the moment.
That's not covered today.
That's not covered today. But we will be presenting today on remote work in a, quote, post-COVID world, best practices and pitfalls. Let me make a note that that post-COVID line was put in prior to the recent surges that we've been having in COVID. So we're really in a current COVID world as we speak. But before we get started, I have a couple housekeeping notes. First, we would love to hear from you. Today, if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your control panel, and only Rocky and I will see the questions submitted, and we will have time to address them at the end of the program or by email if we don't get to you before the end of the presentation. Also, near the end of the program, you'll see a badge on your screen, and you can download your continuing education certificates at that time.
Well, Margaret, we've got a lot to cover today, so can you give us an outline of what we hope to accomplish in the next 30 minutes or so?
Absolutely. So, again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to kick us off, and Rocky and I are going to go back and forth, actually, on different topics related to remote working, which is sometimes called teleworking, sometimes called telecommuting, sometimes called working from home. It's basically all the similar thing. We will discuss first changes in that we are seeing in the workplace due to first the significant advances in technology, as well as the effects of COVID and a lot of remote work that happened during COVID and continues to happen, that are leading to increased requests by employees to telework and work remotely, as well as increases in the number of jobs that are being advertised as remote working job opportunities, such as remote work in the medical practice, medical records, and data entry type jobs. Next, we're going to dive into how employers should consider and address employees' requests to work from home or to remote work, both in the ADA Fmla context as well as in the non-ADA Fmla context, where there's a potential disability or a serious health condition, and those when there is not, and whether employers need to allow or deny those requests in a way that we're going to kind of discuss is how to do that in a way that helps reduce or avoid legal liability and exposure, as well as some other considerations that you may not have thought of if you want to try and look at teleworking and see if that's a viable option for certain positions. Next, we're going to address telecommuting policies, what to have, or should you have one, and what should it say if you do have one. Next, we're going to end up with Telework Legal Risks, looking at wage and hour Flsa claims, particularly for non-exempt employees, protection of confidential information, company information, customer information, and company trade secrets, as well as private information, safety considerations, breach of privacy claims, discrimination claims, and other kinds of legal risks that could be associated with allowing employees to work remotely. So Rocky, first tell us about what we are seeing in the marketplace in terms of the demand for remote work.
Well, Margaret, before the pandemic even started, we were seeing a shift in the workplace. The traditional workplace of going into a brick and mortar location and having your employees there 5 days a week was already beginning to shift before the pandemic occurred. What happened during the pandemic is we learned that teleworking was not only a viable option, but that productivity remained stable for many employers. So what that means is that teleworking is here to stay. And in fact, recent surveys show that 54% of Americans prefer to telework only. That means that half the workforce would like to never walk into an office again. And that number jumps to 64% when you offer a hybrid option, meaning that employees would only come into the workplace 2 days a week. So if you want to remain competitive, you're going to have to adopt telework policies. And we're seeing that from the top down. The Biden administration has announced permanent teleworking policies. One of my dear friends who's worked for the Board of Veterans Appeal in Washington, D.C. for the last 15 years and has been going into the same office building for those 15 years was told, you can leave. You don't have to be here anymore. And so now he's doing his work from Knoxville, Tennessee on his back porch. It's not limited to the federal government either. Amazon has announced that it's going to be implementing permanent teleworking policies. So what we're seeing and what we're learning is that if you want to be a competitive employer and still attract top quality talent, you're going to need a teleworking policy. And we're going to be going over today those situations which require an employer to have a telework policy for certain employees under the ADA and FMLA, and then discretionary teleworking, where an employer can look at the request and says, you know, we're going to allow you to telework at our discretion, but then still have the latitude to bring an employee back into the workplace if necessary. So Margaret, without getting into the ADA and FMLA, are there options for an employer just to adopt a telework policy and it be discretionary and allow employees to work somewhere other than the traditional workplace?
Yeah, I mean, Rocky, the answer to that is absolutely yes. There are those opportunities. I'm going to look in the non-ADA, let's just put that to the side, non-ADA, FMLA context for a second. And, you know, first of all, I guess in a big picture, is there a requirement, a legal requirement that employers provide teleworking policies or teleworking programs and allow employees to participate in those programs? The general answer is no. However, as with anything, there are always exceptions, and we'll get into the exceptions when we talk about the ADA and the FMLA. But just from a non-ADA FMLA context, it's not required, but like Rocky was mentioning, in the, you know, for morale purposes, for employee retention purposes, and to be competitive, do employers need to start thinking about whether to allow a telecommuting policy or a hybrid work plan where there's maybe a mix of both? That would be the smart thing to do, because I think it's only going to move more in that direction in the next 5 to 10 years. So some things that employers need to keep in mind if they're going to offer telework is, if you're going to allow employees with disability or without disabilities to telework, you need to provide those same opportunities to employees who do have disabilities. Give them the same opportunities to those programs and plans that allow for telework. If they're in the same, for example, the same position. That same position, you can't allow one person who's not disabled to telework, but then you prohibit someone who has requested an accommodation under the ADA for a disability to telework in that exact same position. So you can't treat those people differently. Can you allow telework for certain jobs or in certain departments and not others? Absolutely. You can have employees in an IT department where most of the people, all they need to do is work from their computers. Those people can potentially stay all remotely. Yet, say there are a few people in the IT department who are in charge of going around each office and looking at the actual computer hardware and making sure that it is all running well. Those employees may not be eligible potentially for teleworking, or it may need to be on a hybrid basis where they come in a couple days a week and perform the rest of their duties at home or remotely. But the key thing is to evaluate, regardless of the request, is if the essential functions of a job can be effectively, and that's an important word, effectively performed in a remote work environment. Some other considerations that you should think about if you're planning to offer a telework policy or plan to just your general work population is, do they need to get advanced authorization to telework? My recommendation would be absolutely yes. Should you set limitations on teleworking? Absolutely yes. Should you consider the precedent that you may be setting by allowing employees to telework? Again, absolutely yes. You want to make sure you have done that evaluation and understand the implications of what you're doing, and that if you allow it for this person, and someone else is in a similar position, but maybe in a different department, you may need to offer it for that person as well. Otherwise, you may face discrimination claims of not just ADA, but other types of discrimination, sex discrimination, race discrimination claims, and the like. Should you work to ensure, that there's consistent handling of telework requests? Again, absolutely yes. You want there to be no perceived inconsistency in how you apply and allow people to telework, who gets to do it and who doesn't. I've seen that if there is that perceived inconsistency, that typically translates into perceived unfairness and likely discrimination claims based on that perceived unfairness. How can you keep a check on managers and in your company to make sure you do remain consistent and that there is a structure and a plan to follow in terms of teleworking? Having a telecommuting policy. And Rocky, take it away on details about telecommuting policy.
So a telecommuting policy, Margaret, does exactly what you were just saying, but it commits it to writing. And what it does is it allows the company to articulate and set the expectations of when telecommuting will be allowed and what will be considered. And most importantly, it requires that the employee sign off on it, that the employee signs it and says they have read it, acknowledge they received it, and they will comply with it. And in that policy, after you've accomplished that, there are certain things you want to lay out for your employees. You want to lay out that when you're considering telecommuting on a discretionary basis, it's going to be considered by case by case. That there's going to be no, if John got it, I should get it. I know that's a little bit different from what Margaret was saying, but you at least want to communicate that in your policy, that each essential function of the job is going to be evaluated for each particular individual. And after that evaluation has been done, you'll make a determination if the individual can telecommute. The other thing you want to remind the employee is that telecommuting is not an entitlement, but rather it's at the company's discretion. And this is important because jobs change. Job responsibilities for particular employees may change, and the company may now decide that we need to bring this individual back because to do the essential functions of his or her job requires the person to be in the traditional workplace. So you always want to remind the employee that it is at the discretion of the employer, not a right. And finally, you want to set expectations and limitations. You want to let the employee know that just because they're not working in the brick and mortar employer location, that the same policies and procedures that apply in the workforce apply at home. So you have an employee that works 9 to 5 in the traditional workplace, it's going to be the expectation that they're going to be available from 9 to 5 at their home. And then they're not going to be doing other things such as taking care of their children. And as a father of 3 young boys, I can say you can't really effectively work while trying to take care of 3 dependent children. You want to lay that out for your employee, and you want to go through that with them when they are requesting teleworking. Now, that's what I would include in a teleworking policy when you are trying to exercise discretion on allowing someone to work from home. But unfortunately, sometimes you're not going to have the discretion, and you're going to have to go through an actual assessment under the ADA or under the Fmla of whether you are required as an employer to offer teleworking as an accommodation. And Margaret, can you lay out those situations in which an employer, is going to lose the discretion and might be legally obligated or run the risk of violating the ADA and offering teleworking as an accommodation to an employee?
Absolutely. So the best, there will be situations, again, there will be situations where you will need to evaluate and see whether a ADA reasonable accommodation request to work from home should be granted. The process itself is actually not that different than your normal ADA accommodation evaluation, but there are some specific considerations when you are factoring in that it's working remotely. And one thing I'll add too is that many of these requests for accommodation that where individuals are saying that their ADA request for accommodation, the employee has the perceived belief that they can perform the essential functions of their job from home. And what I'm going to walk through is some of the processes and things to think about on the employer, for the employer and the employee, to really evaluate whether, okay, that may be perception, but in reality, can the employee actually effectively perform the essential functions of their job remotely? And thus, can we grant them an ADA accommodation for that? So it starts with just on a basic level, it starts with the employee making a request to telework, to work from home, and saying that it is because of a disability. They don't need to say the magic words ADA. They don't need to say magic words, quote, I need a reasonable accommodation. All they need to say is, I have a medical issue that I believe needs me to work from home, but I can do my job, I believe, from home. Then the next step is for the employer and the employee to engage in what's called the ADA interactive process to see to really determine if that job can be effectively performed, all the essential functions of that job can be effectively performed at home or in a remote location. The interactive process, it needs to be a flexible process, and it's really the employer has to be involved in it, but also the employee. I've had many instances where an employee, for example, emailed a document that it was a picture, and you could read psychological evaluation in the very small picture, but you could not read a word of what was on that page, and there were 4 pages of it, and she said, well, I need an accommodation, and then she never followed up and never provided, even despite multiple requests, never provided that actual document that so that the employer could evaluate whether that person did need an accommodation. So that's the employee not engaging in the reasonable ADA interactive process, and thus, if they won't participate, you can deny the request. But the employee then needs to explain the limitations from the disability that make it difficult for the employee to perform the essential functions of their job at the workplace, but allows them to do it from a remote location. And then the employer, on the flip side, can ask for documentation from the employee's healthcare provider to substantiate or support that request, that they feel like the limitations from a disability make it difficult to do the job in the workplace, but would allow them to do their job from home or in a remote location. So then the employee would also want to look at how the job, get them, invested in the process and ask them how they would perform the essential functions of their job from home. The employee and the employer then together need to look at what those essential functions are of the job. And sometimes that's easy because sometimes there's a job description that is very detailed and accurate, maybe outdated and may need to be revised, and the employee and the employer need to have a conversation if there are certain things on a written job description that are no longer accurate, so everybody's on the same page. But once everybody is on the same page as to what is required of the job, then the employer and the employee need to go through that and see what essential functions can or can't be performed remotely. If there's no written job description, then that's just a conversation where the employer and the employee discuss those essential functions and decide what, and ultimately the employer gets to decide this is what we believe the essential functions of that job are, and whether they can be performed at home. The ADA may require you to assign some minor job functions. For example, if there is a employee relieves the receptionist an hour a week by answering telephones, and they wouldn't be able to do that if they were working remotely. That may be something that needs to be switched to someone else, and then maybe some other small project or assignment that can be performed remotely could be given to the individual with a disability. So minor things may need to be shifted around, but the essential functions, the ADA does not require you to remove an essential function, and the ADA does not require you to create a job that did not already exist as a reasonable accommodation. neither one of those are considered reasonable accommodations. So next, once you have figured out what the essential functions of the job are, then you need to look at things like the type of position. For managers or supervisors, for example, do they need to have face-to-face interaction and coordination with their employees? And that really requires them to be in person at the workplace. Or is it a situation where if they're in 2 or 3 days a week, that would satisfy the need of interaction with their staff? It will depend on the situation. It's a case-by-case analysis. Next, you would want to look at whether the person in that position needs to interact with colleagues in other offices or colleagues and clients and customers outside the office, and whether remote working would allow for that. Can Teams conversations or Teams or video conference calls be done instead of on-site visits or with a customer, or really are there situations where on-site customers it needs to be an in-person visit? Again, these are just all individual things that it's a little bit time consuming, but it is something that really needs to be done and evaluated. Some other things that you might want to look at and consider is whether the position requires the employee to have immediate access to documents. For example, a bank loan officer, do they have to have documents that, loan documents that aren't available or can't be taken away from the bank? So for some of the jobs, there are going to be essential duties that can be, the majority of all the essential functions can be performed remotely, and then there are ones that are just positions where, like a mechanic, where you might have to actually do it on the job.
Margaret, I hate to interrupt you, but I'm seeing a question that's coming in that I think is really a timely question. We call this a post-COVID world, but we're seeing a surge in cases again, and so some employers are starting to recoil back into teleworking or being more on point of whether they needed to grant accommodations. Here's the question. What happens if the employee is not at high risk for having a bad outcome with COVID, or maybe they're vaccinated, but they live or take care of an individual in their home that is extremely at high risk and is not vaccinated or subject to a real bad outcome potentially if they get exposed from COVID? Is that a qualifying reason under the ADA to grant an accommodation and allow that employee to telework?
So that would not be a reasonable accommodation on the ADA and would not be required. And the ADA does protect association with individuals with disabilities, but even the EEOC has said that it does not have to be if someone is at risk at home and is a 2-year-old who isn't vaccinated and the employee is concerned about going to and from the workplace and exposing their child who can't be vaccinated to COVID, for example, it would not be an ADA reasonable accommodation to allow that person to work remotely. Now, if it's association, someone's harassing somebody because they have a family member that they're living with that has a disability, then that's another issue.
Okay.
Well, we're going to wrap up this. We could talk all day about ADA, interactive process, and reasonable accommodations, but we are going to flip now and quickly talk about FMLA, and if there is a intermittent FMLA situation where an employee wants to work remotely, say they're doing chemo in the morning and they want to work remotely in the afternoon, and there's no ADA reasonable accommodation component that needs to happen or needs to be considered in the afternoon. If you allow an employee who wants to work from home in the morning because they want to attend a soccer game of one of their kids in the afternoon, if you allow that, then you may, in certain situations, then you would probably need to allow an employee who is going through chemo, if they want to just spend the rest of the day after their chemo working from home, as long as they actually can work, then you would need to make that, allow that for the FMLA person, so you would avoid any potential FMLA discrimination or retaliation type claims.
So you're telling us that context and what your policies and practices are will really dictate what your requirements are under the FMLA for teleworking.
Absolutely. So let's switch now to to telecommuting and the FLSA. Rocky, is that just a huge can of worms?
Well, so you've decided you're going to have a telework policy and you're going to allow employees to work from home. And so you think everything's going to be great because you're doing what the people asked for. Well, unfortunately, you just need to take 1 or 2 additional steps. And the first risk that is always lurking is the FLSA. You've got to make sure you're paying your employees for the hours that they worked. And in the traditional work environment, the employee would come in, they'd log their time, they would work, and then they would log out, and there would be a supervisor there. So there were actual procedures and mechanisms in place to ensure that the employee got paid for the hours of work. When you remove the employee, though, from the traditional work environment and place them at home, you've got to make sure that those procedures are in place, because there's one thing for certain: that supervisor is not going to be there. And so under the FLSA, you do not want to run into a situation where an employee is working off the clock or outside of their normal hours of operation and they're not logging that time. So the first mechanism that you need to really reinforce is daily time logs, that the employee communicate to the employer through either some kind of electronic submission or some type of paper submission the hours they worked. And then the employee also needs to be reminded that off-the-clock work is not permitted. If the employee needs to work overtime, they need to ask and get leave to work overtime or comply with your procedures on how overtime is requested. That way, again, you know that the employee is working particular hours and you're compensating that employee for the hours worked. Margaret, in your practice, besides just traditional paper logs or time clocks, or are there other mechanisms that people can use to track whether an employee is actually working when they're not at the work site?
Absolutely. There are computer programs and software that I've seen that some of my clients are using that can tell if an employee is, number one, logged into the system, and if they're actively working, and then time periods if there's an hour where there's no activity, where they're clearly not working. And these would be in jobs where most of the job is exclusively working on the computer. There are ways to track that computer activity and to track, have the supervisors track what the employees do. And there's also actually software where you can look on the, you can actually get an image of the employees, what their computer screen says, and what apps and what things are open on their screen to see if they're Googling or watching a tennis event, or if they're doing other things. So that's something that you can look into and can monitor that way.
So, what I can take away from that is just procedures and documentation. You want to have communication and good records, because it's your burden as the employer to substantiate that the employee worked a certain amount of hours and was compensated for that time. So once you run past the FLSA risk, you need to take another step, because once you remove the employee from the work environment, you're removing the employee's access to your trade secrets or your customers' data. So that's why it's important to have non-disclosure agreements in place for your employees, so they understand that they're not supposed to disclose your trade secrets. I mean, could you imagine if you were one of the individuals that had access to the secret Coca-Cola recipe and you left it on the dining room table? That wouldn't be permitted. That should be absolutely communicated, that if you've got such precious data, it needs to be electronically secured. Similarly, your company's employees, or excuse me, your customer information for your work needs to be protected. As lawyers, we have to protect our clients' information, and for many employers out there, they need to ensure that their customers' data is protected. So that means you have to use secure systems and have good privacy policies in place. And finally, you got to make sure that the employer knows what they have to pay for. You only have to pay for the basic supplies. So if your employee needs a computer, you provide a computer. But you don't have to renovate their home. You don't need to give them a whole new workspace. That's on the employee. We're wrapping up here, but I'm seeing one last question coming in on, we've allowed teleworking, but now we want to cancel teleworking or bring back those individuals after COVID is finally over. Well, let's first off hope that it's finally over sooner rather than later, and that can be permitted. But like anything else, the devil's in the details, as Margaret told you at the very beginning of this. And so if it's discretionary teleworking, you probably can cancel that. But if it's teleworking because of an ADA accommodation, again, you need to go through the interactive process and ensure that you can cancel that. We didn't get to all your questions today, and for that we're sorry, but we will get to them. We will email you directly in response to your question, either Margaret or myself. All I have to say is thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a few good takeaways for your organization. We hope you will join us for the rest of our programming this week. And again, thank you for your time and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.